Germany had won World War II? What would the world be like today if we were still under Nazi rule, even here in the United States of America? In 2003, Newt Gingrich and William Forstchen penned together a trilogy, starting with the first one called Gettysburg. It was also another alternate history timeline. What if the South had won Gettysburg? How would it have changed the course of history? I think we as consumers like the idea of the what-if scenarios. What if these things had happened differently? What if Kennedy wasn't shot? What would the face of American politics be like? What if abortion was never legalized? How many lives would have been saved? Could cancer have been cured? Could peace come to the Middle East through someone who was cut off in the womb, or living past the womb? You see, these are scenarios that it's sometimes fun to talk about. What if, what if, what if? Or we might say, what if Jesus hadn't been raised? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul affirms the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his triumph over the grave. O grave, where is your victory? Grave, where's your sting? What is it that you hold over humanity? What can you touch us with? The Hebrew writer calls it his triumph over the devil and his power of death in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14. It is one of the core principles of the gospel that Jesus died, he was buried, and he was resurrected on the third day. But what if it had never happened? Or if the story stopped before the resurrection? Would our lives be any different? If the story stopped at the manger, we would have the incarnation of God on earth, but we'd have no hope. That's the simple fact of it. The Old Testament contains several Christophanies, as we call them, or sometimes a theophany, the idea of God in some physical manner implanting himself on the earth and being visible by the physical material world. Most people jump quickly to Exodus chapter 3 and the bush that is burning but is not consumed. It is a physical manifestation of God, a theophany. But when we talk about a Christophany, it's something even more specific than that. It is an actual human form, an incarnation of God. We see it, for example, in Genesis chapter 18, when the Lord and his angels come to Abraham, and Abraham runs out to meet them, and he serves them. And of course, they eventually will go on to Sodom and Gomorrah and save Lot and his family. But here it is a meeting between Abraham and, it says, God. Or in Genesis chapter 32, where Jacob wrestles with, some translations say wrestles with an angel, but what the text actually says is that he wrestled with a man, and then whenever God changes his name, he refers to him as God. He names the place the face of God. The man names Jacob wrestling with God. Hosea chapter 12 and verse 3 specifically identifies that Jacob wrestled with God. An incarnation of deity happened in Genesis 32. In Joshua chapter 5, the commander of the Lord's army comes to Joshua. And at the end of the chapter there's an exchange between them. And yet there's something very interesting here, something that angels do not do because they do not deserve. We see it another time in Exodus 3 before the burning bush, when the bush said, or when God said to Moses, take the shoes off of your feet, for this is holy ground. And the commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua in Joshua 5 and verse 15, put the shoes off of your feet, because this is holy ground. He is in the very presence of God in a human incarnate fleshly manifestation, a Christophany, as you would please. And yet those incarnations of God in the flesh on this earth did not bring the hope that we want. God's plan continued to unfold. So if the story stopped at the manger, at the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, that doesn't bring us hope. But what if the story stopped instead at the temple in Luke chapter 2 with Jesus in this amazing inspirational moment where he is discussing the law and the prophets with the Jewish leadership? If that's when the story stopped, we would have a wonderful testimony of Jesus' childhood, but we wouldn't have hope. At the end of that section, it says that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Certainly, that's an exciting circumstance, that Jesus is growing into his own, that he is becoming the man that God needs him to be to change the world. But God's scheme of redemption wasn't finished in the temple that day, nor the caravan going home. And if the story had stopped there, we would be without hope. But what if the story stopped at his baptism? Certainly the seminal moment of his ministry, we would be witness to the fulfilled righteousness that he says, I'm doing this to fulfill all righteousness, but not hope. We wouldn't be a witness to a hope in anything in this world. When Jesus came to John in Matthew 3, he was seeking to be baptized by the baptizer. And when John objected, Jesus said, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. It was right and proper for Jesus to be baptized by John, or as Jesus specifically said, it is fitting. This is what should be done. It was an important part of his ministry, setting the example for all disciples to follow in his footsteps, while being a part of God's plan. Baptism was part of God's plan, and he needed his disciples, he needed his followers to follow in those footsteps. And so to fulfill all righteousness, he himself submitted to baptism. But while it is part of God's plan, it isn't the culmination of God's plan. It's not the end of it. We might say there was more to come. And if the story stopped at his baptism, we would be left with no hope. If the story stopped with his sermon, we would have a glorious guide to kingdom living, what it means to live with God. But we would still have no hope. You think about Matthew chapters 5 through 7, from the Beatitudes to their application to the call to obedience. The sermon truly encapsulates for us the greatness of Christian living through selflessness. Think about some of the passages. Blessed are the poor in spirit, or you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others to be seen of them. Or no man can serve two masters. Seek first the kingdom of God. Enter in by the narrow gate. Or be like the wise man who has built his house upon the rock. Those are some of the most precious principles to us. We continue to look back to those, and we exult in the opportunity that we have to live this kingdom life. And it's not just any life, it is the best life. There is no greater life than to follow the teaching of the great Sermon on the Mount. But the story doesn't stop at the Sermon on the Mount. Even with the pattern to follow, God's quest for man's salvation wasn't finished. If the story stopped there, we would have no hope. Heaven would not be an option for mankind. But what if the story stopped at the Transfiguration? It's one of the most glorious moments for Jesus during his entire time on earth. We would have the transition of authority that is depicted there, but we would still have no hope. In Matthew 17, in the first 8 verses, when Jesus took Peter and a few other disciples to go up the mountain, he showed them his eternal glory. Mark, in his account of it, comments that Jesus' clothes became so white as the old translation says that no fuller's soap could get them that white. There is nothing on earth could bleach the material to be that bright white. Nothing. This is a moment of the glory of Christ being shown. But it is here that Jesus is seen speaking with Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. That old Hebraism, which is used throughout the New Testament to refer to everything of the Old Testament writings, that all culminates right here. And whatever authority, whatever right ways the Old Testament held. When Moses and Elijah are taken away and Jesus is left, we see that that authority is passing away from them, and it now lies in Jesus. This is my beloved Son. What does God say? Listen to him. At the Transfiguration, we see the transition of authority. We see how God thoroughly intends for Jesus to be the one who is speaking for this day and age. He is the proclamation of God to humanity for the final epoch of time on this earth. This is it. These are what were referred to as the last days. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2. Boy, I went to Hebrews 1 a lot today, haven't I? Hebrews 1 and verse 2, and he says again, in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Jesus holds all authority, both in heaven and on earth. He has authority over all flesh, John 17, 1 and 2. He has authority over the church, Ephesians 1, 22 and 23. Jesus has all authority, and we've seen it transitioned at the Transfiguration. But even with the authority of Christ established, God's blueprints for grace have not reached its conclusion. We're still left without hope if the story stops on the Mount of Transfiguration. What if it went further? What if the story stopped at Peter's confession? You are the Christ, the Son of God. We know who the Christ would be. We could point to Jesus, say he was the Messiah, that he was the one promised throughout the Old Testament, the one who was coming, the righteous one, the great prophet, the king, the son of David to sit upon the throne, the seed of Abraham. We could point to him and say, that's the one. But we wouldn't have hope. For Mark, in Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30, the confession was the turning point of the entire story. It was a glorious observation of faith by Peter. You are the Christ. No one in Mark's gospel, remember we mentioned this, had at that point no man had pointed out the messiahship of Christ. And for Mark in that story, this is where it all turns and begins to go toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward his death. But if the story stopped right there, then God's strategy for man's salvation would be thwarted. It's done. If that's all there was. If the story stopped at the supper. Luke records Jesus saying that I have desired to eat this with you. Right? It was the final Passover. If it had stopped at the supper, we would have the promise of a coming kingdom and gathering with Christ in that kingdom, but we would still not have hope. Jesus gathered with his disciples to eat that Passover meal. He was very specific. This Passover meal, not just any Passover, but this one, because he knew that it was the very last Passover. Not just with them because he was going to die. This was the last Passover ever of all history. He longed for this moment because he longed for them to see and be prepared for the coming kingdom. After the Passover was finished, he instituted what we call the Lord's Supper, which itself was it continues as the focal point of Christian worship today. This is why we were here. It points to the death of Christ. And he was looking forward to that moment when he would eventually eat this supper again with them in the kingdom. But if the story stops in that upper room, gathered around that table with the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine and the sopping in the cup and the exit of Judas, there's no hope. There's no gathering around this table. There's no joining with Christ if there is no resurrection. If the story stopped in the garden, we would have seen the common nature that Jesus shares with us. To me, it's one of those beautiful scenes, but if it stopped there, we'd have no hope. On the night of his betrayal, Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, the garden literally of the oil press, to pray in Matthew 26 and verses 36 through 46. He sought relief and comfort from the Father. If it be possible, let this cup pass away from me, in that hour of his trial. It is one of the most poignant scenes of all the Gospels. We weep with him. We identify with the willing spirits of the disciples, and too often the weakness of our own personal flesh. We see a man who was broken down by hunger. We see a man who was broken down by exhaustion. We see a man who is broken down by emotions as the world is weighing down upon him in that garden. And then we see the soldiers walk into the garden. They came to arrest Jesus that very night. And if the story had stopped with his arrest in the garden, mankind's hope would be aborted before the story ever started. What if the story stopped with Jesus standing before Pilate? We would have witnessed the greatest display of meekness that humankind has ever known or seen in Jesus, but we wouldn't have hope. As Jesus was schlepped from trial to trial and travesty to travesty, he endured the indignity in silence. Matthew 26 and verse 63. The priests insulted him. The council denied him justice. The soldiers mocked him. Pilate humiliated him. Behold the man. As a sheep before her shearers was silent, so Jesus stuck to God's plan for redeeming the world. But as much shame and disgrace and dishonor they brought to Jesus in that moment, it wasn't over. The story wasn't finished. But what if it stopped on the cross? We would have the ultimate sacrifice. A sacrifice to shed the blood that would purchase us from slavery to sin, from the taskmaster of the devil himself, but we wouldn't have hope in a life after now. If the garden was one of the more poignant scenes, this may be the saddest moment in all of human history. As Kevin read this morning in our Lord's Supper meditation, and at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which Mark interprets for us in Mark 34, my God, why have you forsaken me? The loneliness, the forsakenness, that experience that Jesus experienced in that moment, it pointed for us to the cost of our salvation. Think about that. What did it cost for me to be here? What did it cost for me to be saved? What did it cost for my sins to be forgiven? What did it cost for me to receive grace, which we often say is so freely offered? But grace isn't free. A price that was willingly paid by Jesus for a relationship with God that I could never afford. The Bible says that he became obedient to the point of death. Philippians 2 and verse 8, but it doesn't stop there. Even death on the cross. There was something different. Something of a spectacle. Cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree. It wasn't just a death, it was a spectacular death where people were mocking, people were wagging their heads, people were insulting Jesus as he hung there. He became our sacrifice. And in Hebrews 9, in verse 12, it says that he entered for every one of us, into the holy places, not by means of blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. He secured for us redemption in that sacrifice. There was forgiveness of sins. But even in that death cry, there was no hope for heaven. But the story didn't stop on the cross. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Acts 2:24. It was the gospel that Peter is preaching on the day of Pentecost, that old Jerusalem gospel. The story didn't stop at the cross. The story didn't stop at his burial in a tomb of another person. The story didn't stop there. It continued to the day in which he was resurrected. He was resurrected to witnesses. He appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. 1 Corinthians 15, 5 and 6. The Romans couldn't stop it. The Jews couldn't deny it. Jesus had risen. And in that fact, we have hope. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We are born to a living hope, a vibrant hope, a hope that gives us joy and anticipation of a heavenly realm, of a dwelling in the very presence of God. And we have that hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. If the story stops 1 second before that resurrection, our hope is banished. Thank God there was a resurrection, a breaking forth from the dead. We have hope because the tomb is empty. We have hope that the Savior lives. We have hope because God's plan was finished. We have hope. And that's it. We walk out these doors in anticipation of heaven because we have hope. And we want to share that. We want others to be a part of that same hope. The gospel plan was finished, but the gospel story still lives with pages to be written. We talk about the Bible as one story of the greatness of God and the coming of Jesus Christ for the salvation of mankind. That's the one great story, but it's not just one story. It's our story. It's the story that we share in, and we share it with Christ, that Jesus died and was buried and was resurrected on the third day. That is our story. And it continues with us today. What will it say in your story? What will it say in eternity that you waited until it was too late? What will your story say? Will it say you weren't convinced? Will it say that he started well and gave up? Will it say you thought you had one more day? Or will your story say that today was the day of salvation? Today, the good news was fulfilled in you, that today you were resurrected with Christ in a resurrection like his, raised to walk in a newness of life. How will you finish your story? Tonight you have an opportunity to write that chapter, that today was your day of salvation, if you'll respond to his invitation while we stand and while we sing.